Money changes people. You've seen it happen. The more successful they become, the colder they get. More anxious, more addicted, more emotionally fragile. And sometimes more afraid than they were before they became rich. Success can become a prison. The strangest part, most people never notice the transformation happening because externally their lives look better. But internally, something starts collapsing. Peace disappears, stillness disappears, gratitude disappears, and eventually nothing feels like enough anymore. In this exploration, we'll examine why modern success quietly destroys so many people psychologically, and how Stoic philosophy can help you build wealth without becoming emotionally dependent on it. By the end, you'll understand exactly how to pursue success without sacrificing your peace, your freedom, or your inner stability. 2,000 years ago, ancient Stoic philosophers discovered something dangerous, something modern culture completely forgot. It's possible to become wealthy without becoming spiritually weak. In fact, some of the most powerful men in human history deliberately practiced discomfort while building massive fortunes. Why? Because they understood something terrifying about human psychology. The moment your happiness depends on comfort, you become easy to control. And this changes everything. The lie. Modern ambition sells. Most people misunderstand Stoicism immediately. They think Stoics rejected money, rejected ambition, rejected success. That's completely false. Seneca, one of history's most famous Stoics, was extraordinarily wealthy. He owned luxurious villas, gardens, servants, political influence. At one point, he became one of the richest men in the Roman Empire. And yet, he also wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." Think carefully about that. Seneca wasn't attacking wealth. He was attacking psychological dependence. That's very different. Then there was Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of armies, one of the most powerful men alive. And despite absolute power surrounding him constantly, he spent years writing private reflections reminding himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Your mind, not your status, not your wealth, not public opinion, your mind. That was the Stoic battlefield. Because the Stoics understood something modern culture ignores. External success means nothing if your inner world becomes unstable. And this is where modern ambition becomes dangerous. Most people don't actually chase money for freedom. They chase it because they're trying to escape feelings of inadequacy, to feel respected, important, safe, enough. Which means even after becoming wealthy, the insecurity remains, just hidden beneath luxury, phones buzzing, people checking bank accounts, influencers filming rented supercars, workers eating lunch at their desks, a teenager comparing himself online. Modern ambition has become emotional addiction disguised as success. People say, "I want money for freedom," but watch closely. Most people actually want validation, admiration, status, proof they matter. And because of that, every upgrade becomes psychological quicksand. A nicer apartment, a better car, designer clothes, exclusive restaurants. At first, it feels exciting. Then something dangerous happens. Your nervous system adapts. What once felt luxurious starts feeling normal, then necessary, then insufficient. And eventually, your identity becomes fused to your lifestyle. Now losing status feels like losing yourself. That's the terrifying part. Not poverty, dependency. Because once peace depends on appearances, freedom disappears. That's not wealth. That's emotional slavery. Now here's where the Stoics become deeply uncomfortable for modern people. Even while wealthy, Seneca intentionally practiced poverty. A wealthy Roman philosopher sleeping on a rough floor, simple bread, worn clothing, cold rooms, no luxury, no comfort. And modern people hear this and immediately think, Why would a rich man choose discomfort? Because Seneca understood something terrifying about comfort. Comfort weakens people gradually, not all at once, silently, almost invisibly. He asked himself a brutal question regularly: is this what I feared? Meaning, if wealth disappeared, would life actually become unbearable? Or was the fear itself an illusion? Most people never test this. They spend their entire lives running from discomfort, which means they never discover how strong they actually are. The Stoics trained differently. They rehearsed hardship, not because they enjoyed suffering, because they refused to become fragile. And this created extraordinary psychological freedom, because the man who can survive simplicity cannot be controlled by luxury. Seneca wrote, "Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare. Train yourself to need less." This wasn't self-punishment, it was mental conditioning. The Stoics understood fear loses power when reality is faced directly. Stock market crashes, people screaming on trading floors, stress eating, late-night anxiety, a man refreshing crypto prices obsessively. Most financial destruction isn't caused by lack of intelligence, it's caused by emotional instability. People panic, overreact, seek immediate relief, and fear destroys long-term thinking. The Stoics understood this centuries ago. That's why emotional control became central to their philosophy. Not emotional numbness, control. There's a difference. When everyone else reacted emotionally, Stoics stayed disciplined. That created an enormous advantage, because calm people think more clearly, and clear thinking compounds, especially during chaos. This is true in business, investing, leadership, relationships, war, life itself. Panic destroys judgment. Modern society constantly manipulates emotion. Fear headlines, comparison culture, outrage, consumption. Everyone is emotionally overstimulated, which makes calmness extremely rare, and rare qualities become powerful. That's why the Stoics trained themselves to remain steady under pressure, because emotional stability creates strategic advantage. Now imagine becoming the most powerful man on earth. Armies obey your commands. Nations fear your decisions. Millions of lives depend on your judgment. Most people think power creates confidence, but history shows something darker. Power often creates paranoia, isolation, emotional corruption. And nobody understood this better than Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius ruled Rome during one of the most chaotic periods in its history. War, disease, political betrayal, economic instability. And despite having unimaginable power, he constantly reminded himself, very little is needed to make a happy life. Think about how strange that is. A man who could possess almost anything, training himself to desire less. Why? Because Marcus understood something terrifying. The ego adapts unbelievably fast. Today's privilege becomes tomorrow's expectation, and expectations quietly destroy gratitude. That's why he constantly reflected on impermanence, death, change, loss. Not because he was pessimistic, because he was protecting himself psychologically. Most people think luxury creates strength. Marcus knew the opposite could happen. Luxury can slowly make people fragile, dependent, fearful of losing comfort, and eventually controlled by the very lifestyle they built. The moment peace depends on status, freedom disappears. Luxury influences, private jets, people taking photos instead of experiencing moments, social media likes exploding across screens. Modern people don't just pursue success anymore, they perform success. And that changes human psychology completely. Because once your identity becomes performance, you can never fully relax. Every achievement must be seen, validated, admired, documented, which creates permanent emotional tension. You're no longer living, you're managing perception. And this creates a hidden prison, externally successful, internally exhausted. The Stoics would have considered this deeply dangerous, because public approval is unstable by nature. Crowds change, opinions shift, status disappears. And if your emotional stability depends on applause, your peace becomes fragile. That's why Marcus Aurelius wrote privately instead of publicly. His journal wasn't performance, it was self-correction, discipline, awareness. The crowd can only control the man who needs applause. And maybe that's why modern people feel so exhausted, because they're constantly performing versions of themselves, trying to appear successful instead of becoming internally strong. The Stoics had a brutal definition of freedom. Could you lose comfort and remain calm? Not numb, not emotionless, calm. Could you still think clearly, still maintain dignity, still function under pressure? Because if losing luxury destroys your identity, luxury owns you. And this is why Stoics practiced discomfort intentionally. Cold weather, simple food, silence, minimalism, temporary hardship. These weren't punishments, they were resistance training for the mind. The Stoics understood something modern culture ignores. Fear feeds on imagined helplessness. But once you voluntarily face discomfort, fear starts shrinking. Seneca wrote, "He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a living man." And the same principle applies to failure, rejection, embarrassment, loss. The more people avoid discomfort, the more fragile they become, which means modern comfort culture creates psychological weakness. The Stoics trained the opposite: strength, adaptability, inner steadiness. And over time, that created extraordinary confidence. Not loud confidence, calm confidence. The kind built from knowing, I can survive difficulty. Modern people are surrounded by comfort, climate control, instant entertainment, food delivered instantly, infinite distraction. And yet, anxiety keeps rising, depression keeps rising, burnout keeps rising. Why? Because comfort and peace are not the same thing. The Stoics understood this long ago. A comfortable life can still produce a weak mind. In fact, constant comfort often creates fragility, because anything constantly avoided becomes psychologically terrifying. Silence becomes uncomfortable, boredom becomes unbearable, failure feels catastrophic, rejection feels personal, and eventually, people become emotionally dependent on stimulation. That's why modern life feels so exhausting. The nervous system never rests. Notifications, comparison, pressure, noise, consumption. The Stoics moved in the opposite direction: stillness, reflection, self-control. And over time, this created an extraordinary level of emotional resilience. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." Think about how radical that idea is. Modern people believe happiness comes from external upgrades. The Stoics believed happiness came from internal mastery. That changes the entire game, because external conditions are unstable. Money can disappear, status can disappear, beauty fades, power fades, public opinion changes overnight. But inner discipline? That travels with you everywhere. Most people think wealth changes human character. The Stoics believed wealth reveals character. Money amplifies what already exists. An insecure person with money often becomes more insecure. An arrogant person with money becomes more arrogant. A fearful person with money becomes obsessed with protecting status. And this explains something modern culture struggles to understand. Why do some wealthy people still seem miserable? Because external abundance cannot solve internal instability. The Stoics saw this everywhere in Rome. Powerful politicians terrified of losing influence, rich elites consumed by greed, men surrounded by luxury, still emotionally restless. Seneca warned about this constantly. He wrote, No man is crushed by misfortune unless he has first been deceived by prosperity. Prosperity can deceive you, meaning luxury creates the illusion of permanence, safety, control. But life changes quickly, and people who become emotionally attached to comfort suffer deeply when reality shifts. That's why Stoics trained themselves never to worship success. Enjoy it, use it, but never become psychologically dependent on it. That distinction changes everything. Most people are not controlled by logic. They are controlled by fear. Fear of embarrassment, fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of losing status, fear of becoming ordinary. And because of these fears, people betray themselves constantly. They stay in careers they hate, pretend to be people they are not, chase lifestyles they cannot afford, work endlessly for validation they never fully receive. The Stoics considered this a form of slavery, because a person controlled by fear cannot be free. That's why they intentionally trained themselves to face discomfort, not to suffer, to weaken fear. Epictetus once said, "Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants." Few wants. Not because ambition is wrong, but because endless craving destroys peace. And modern culture is built entirely around endless craving. More money, more status, more attention, more stimulation. But the finish line keeps moving, which means people remain psychologically restless forever. The Stoics stepped outside that trap, and that's what made them powerful. Human beings crave recognition, respect, admiration, the feeling of mattering. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The danger begins when identity becomes dependent on external approval, because approval is unstable. Crowds are unstable. Public opinion changes constantly. One moment people praise you, the next moment they forget you completely. The Stoics understood this deeply. That's why they trained themselves never to build emotional stability on public perception. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Fame after life is no different from oblivion." Think about that. A Roman emperor, one of the most powerful men in history, telling himself fame ultimately means nothing. Why? Because he understood how seductive attention can become. The ego always wants more recognition, more praise, more status. But the more identity depends on those things, the more fragile a person becomes. That's why modern culture creates so much anxiety. People are constantly comparing themselves. Income, looks, lifestyle, followers. Success becomes performance, and performance creates exhaustion. The Stoics escaped that trap, not by rejecting success, but by refusing to worship it. Most people fear failure because they attach identity to outcomes. If they fail, they feel worthless, embarrassed, humiliated. But Stoics separated identity from results. That changed everything. Failure became information, training, feedback, not personal destruction. Epictetus taught, "Circumstances don't make the man, they only reveal him to himself." The Stoics believed difficult moments reveal character, pressure reveals emotional discipline, loss reveals attachment, failure reveals insecurity. And instead of avoiding those revelations, Stoics studied them, because self-awareness was more valuable than ego protection. Modern people often spend enormous energy protecting identity, protecting appearance, protecting pride. But the Stoics focused on truth instead. What am I afraid of? What controls me emotionally? Why does this disturb me? Those questions create transformation, not motivational slogans, honest self-observation. That was the Stoic path. And over time, it created extraordinary emotional maturity. There's an important distinction most people never think about. A person can be rich without being free, and a person can have very little while remaining psychologically free. The Stoics believed true freedom begins internally, not financially. Because external wealth can always disappear, markets collapse, economies fail, empires fall. Even Rome eventually declined. But inner discipline survives external instability. That's why Stoicism focused so heavily on mastering perception, mastering reaction, mastering desire. Not because desire itself is evil, but because uncontrolled desire creates endless suffering. Seneca wrote, "If you wish to make a man rich, do not add to his money, but subtract from his desires." Modern culture teaches the opposite. Consume more, desire more, upgrade constantly. But endless craving creates endless restlessness. The Stoics understood that peace comes from stability of mind, not endless stimulation. That's why they could enjoy wealth without becoming psychologically consumed by it. The word detachment scares many people. They assume it means becoming cold, emotionless, disconnected. But Stoic detachment meant something very different. It meant refusing to let external events completely control your inner state. That's strength, not weakness. Because life is unpredictable. People betray you. Money disappears. Health changes. Plans collapse. And if your emotional stability depends entirely on perfect circumstances, life will break you repeatedly. The Stoics trained emotional flexibility instead, adaptability, inner steadiness. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Obstacles were not viewed as punishment. They were viewed as training, preparation, growth. And this created a completely different mindset toward difficulty. Most people ask, "Why is this happening to me?" Stoics asked, "What is this teaching me?" That single shift changes everything. Many people secretly believe success will permanently solve their emotional struggles. If I become successful enough, then I'll finally feel secure. But reality rarely works that way, because insecurity rooted in identity cannot be solved externally. The Stoics understood this centuries ago. That's why they focused inward first, not outward. They understood something modern psychology now confirms. Human beings adapt quickly. Pleasure fades, excitement fades, status normalizes, and eventually the mind begins craving the next upgrade. That cycle never ends, which is why many wealthy people still feel restless, externally abundant, internally unstable. The Stoics escaped this trap by focusing on character instead of stimulation, discipline instead of indulgence, meaning instead of image. And that created a type of peace modern culture rarely experiences. A quieter peace, a stable peace, a peace not dependent on constant validation. Life eventually becomes chaotic for everyone. Unexpected illness, financial uncertainty, loss, failure, rejection. No philosophy matters unless it functions during difficulty. And this is where Stoicism becomes incredibly practical. The Stoics trained themselves to focus only on what remained under their control. Their thoughts, their reactions, their choices, not outcomes, not public opinion, not external events. Epictetus taught, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." That mindset creates emotional stability because people suffer enormously trying to control what cannot be controlled. Other people, markets, the future, reputation. But the Stoics redirected energy inward, toward discipline, toward character, toward clear thinking. And that made them resilient during uncertainty. While others panicked, Stoics adapted. Luxury has a hidden psychological cost. It raises emotional dependency. The more comfort becomes necessary, the more fragile people become without it. This is why many wealthy people secretly fear simplicity. Not because simplicity is unbearable, because they've forgotten how to exist without stimulation. The Stoics deliberately interrupted this dependency. Simple meals, periods of discomfort, minimal living, not to reject pleasure, to preserve freedom. Seneca understood that dependence weakens courage, because people terrified of losing comfort become easier to manipulate, easier to control, easier to intimidate. That's why Stoicism produced strong individuals, not because they avoided fear, because they faced fear repeatedly, until fear lost authority over their decisions. And maybe that's the deepest form of wealth, a mind that remains stable regardless of circumstances.